let's talk about some more concept stuff, that being event tick. You've probably heard to avoid it like the plague, and I'm going to tell you that that is more or less good advice, but I'm here to add a little bit of nuance to it. First, a little bit of why I think so many people tell you to avoid using event tick, and that is mostly because what ends up happening is that instead of making custom events that run only when they have to, so this event then runs custom event number 2 and so on and so forth only when they get called, or even making functions. What a lot of beginning programmers in Unreal Engine and Blueprint tend to do is just stuff everything into event tick. If you're lucky, what they'll do is they'll add in a bunch of branching nodes with conditions to check whether or not, hey, should this code run now? If true, run that code. If false, we go into the next branching node, where we check something again, and that is an improvement. But of course, you still don't want to make your entire game in the tick event of your separate actors. That said, that advice then evolves into you should never use event tick. And that also doesn't make sense, because event tick is just a frame loop. The very basic concept on which every game engine is built. A loop that loops around and does things like rendering the new frames, calculating new information, etc, etc. You will find it in literally every game engine. A loop function with a delta time in order to make things like movement inside of that loop be frame rate independent as far as like the speed goes. That doesn't exist to not be used, right? That exists to be used in things that need to update every frame. And I think generally, movement is a good thing. A lot of the movement that you're doing in Unreal Engine will probably be physics-based movement. That's things like applying a force, like with the launch character function, right? This applies a force which runs on the physics loop, which is entirely separate from event tick, and that is how you will move a lot of your characters. But sometimes you have something, and I actually have something open here. This character moves over a spline, and I directly set its position to the desired position along the spline, or at least to move it toward that. That is something that needs to happen every frame of the game. You don't want to do that only on a X amount of times per second. You want to do that every time a new frame renders. You want this guy to be in a new position. So you do it in event tick. I can show you the code for it. It is in C++. I know that this is just a general tutorial that's going to be watched by mostly Blueprint users for the most part, most likely. But here we have a couple of things, right? We've got my begin play function, and stick with me here, I'm going to walk you through it, where we first check whether or not we have a spline actor. If we do, we set a certain value to it, and then we get the spline's length and all that kind of stuff. That's all not too relevant at the moment. Then we have the tick function. This is just the event tick, but in C++. And here what I do is I check the distance to the player, which also needs to happen every frame, because if we're too close to the player, we should stop moving along the spline because we've reached the player and we should be attacking. So if the player is further away than these 500 units in this case, then we run the move along spline function. Now, you will note that I did make it a separate function. That's just for organizational purposes. Essentially, I could just copy paste this code right into here. So all of this still does happen inside of the tick event, which is just a bunch of stuff that moves the character along a spline that it gets applied to, and it's not really relevant to go into how all of this works in detail. All that matters is that this runs in event tick, right? But at the same time, we've got some functions here that are only called when they are relevant. So I'm not stuffing everything into event tick. The only thing that is happening on tick is the thing that should be happening every single frame. I've heard some people on partly my tutorials, some other content online, saying you shouldn't use event tick. What you should use is an event by timer, or a timer by event, and then just set this timer to a very low number like 1/100th. I'm gonna tell you right now that this still will just run your event every frame. This is exactly the same but you've now also wasted some memory in creating a timer handle, which isn't much. Like, this is probably only like a couple of bytes. That's probably fine, right? But you're not gaining anything by doing this. If you are doing something that only happens once a second and you want to loop that, here you're gaining something. Here you're only running certain code once a second instead of every single frame. If you're running this at 50 or 60 frames per second, you are saving 59 executions of this code. If you're running this at like 120 frames per second, you're saving 119 executions of whatever this code is. There is certainly things that you want to do on a timer instead of always doing them in event play. And the same thing goes for if I add a timeline here. You might say, okay, but you can use this instead of event tick because I heard that is better. And still here, we are just, at the end of the day, doing the same thing. We're still moving this character to its new position every single frame. The timeline just puts that into a slightly more user-friendly way of doing it, where you can have a curve and you can easily change stuff about that. Like we can have like a float curve or even a vector curve or whatever, and we can do like interesting stuff with this, right? We can add a key here, and then we can like put this here. We can add a key here, and then we can put that down there. You can make interesting shapes with this. That really helps from a user perspective. But this still runs every frame and just automatically kind of applies the delta time and everything to the updated information that comes out of this timeline. This isn't saving you any significant performance. This is starting to end up similar to my video about casting, where there's a common misconception that you should just avoid using casting or avoid using event tick at all costs, and there's these alternatives that you should use instead. And then if you don't actually understand the reasoning why you should avoid certain things most of the time, you end up using these alternatives 100% of the time and wasting your own efforts in doing so sometimes. So it is important that you understand why you're not doing something and when you are allowed to do that. Go watch my video about casting if you want to know more about that as well, but event tick is fine for things that need to happen every frame. I'm going to give you another example. This one was about moving along a spline. I also have my third-person character, which this character can grab onto ledges of certain objects and hang there. I made a tutorial about this a while ago as well, showing you how to set up something like that. And there, I've gotten a few comments as well to not use event tick. Event tick is bad, but what are we doing in that, right? This is the tick event in C++ for my player character. It's a little bit bigger, also because there is certain things in here that are no longer in use. But for example, we have the ledge grabbing and updating all the nearby enemies. To be fair, this probably could run on a timer. This doesn't necessarily need to be updated every frame. I like it to be updated every frame, but this probably could do with being updated static like 10 times a second instead. But the ledge grab is quite important that it happens every frame, because what we're doing here is, if I just open this function, is we are doing a couple of line traces. And that line tracer, in the end, what it does is it traces down just in front of the character to see, hey, are we close to any like geometry, any collision? And then if it detects that, it does another line tracer to detect like the other side of like the ledge, the up and down side instead of the horizontal side. And from there it figures out some stuff. Again, go watch the tutorial for blueprints if you want to figure out more about that. But the thing is, that downward line trace, it does that every single frame as long as the character is in midair. I think even specifically as long as the character's velocity is moving downward. So as long as you're moving up, it doesn't even do the line traces. It checks whether or not you are moving down, and if you're moving down, it does do the line traces, because you don't want to spam line tracing too much. Not too bad for like one character to be line tracing every frame, but you do want to be careful with that. Anyway, the point being is that that is still something that you do want to have happen every frame, or at least close to every frame. At some point you achieve like over 100 frames per second, maybe you can start arguing, maybe you don't need that many line traces, but for any reasonable frame rate, that being around 60 or so frames per second, you want that line trace to happen that often. Because otherwise, if you're just doing that about 10 times a second, it's going to feel unresponsive, and there's actually going to be a chance at some point that you miss grabbing a ledge because your character just moved between the line traces too much and it missed the ledge altogether. So things like that also you would very much prefer to do in event tick. The advice you hear to avoid event tick is still valid. You should not be throwing everything into event tick just because it makes your life easier. Because that means that you are not learning how fundamentally code works and how computer communication works and how like different objects can talk to each other, and you're going to limit your growth in that if you just stuff everything into the tick event. But at the same time, you do need to understand why that is the case and when it is okay to do it, because otherwise you end up wasting your own time. And as a developer, we never have enough time to begin with. So please don't go around wasting time setting up constructs that don't actually end up helping you or increasing your performance and just end up taking more time. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page. A huge thank you to my Cave Student tier supporters, Earl Monseval Erno, and my Cave Digger tier supporters, Sir J. Thomas,